Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our final event in the Frankie program roster for this fall. I am Priya Natarajan, the current director of Yale's flagship interdisciplinary program, the Frankie Program in Science and the Humanities. We are utterly delighted to bring to you today, as part of our distinguished speaker book talks, the acclaimed author Dava Sobel. But before I tell you more about her and the new book that she will be talking to us about, I would like to thank our benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Frankie, whose generosity in setting up the Frankie program in Science and the Humanities has allowed us to host events like this one and continuing our work in bridging disciplinary silos by catalyzing conversations, intellectual exchange, and research that crosses academic disciplinary boundaries. Now on to Dava Sobel, who really needs no introduction. As all of you know, she's one of the living writers whose stories and accounts of science, the history of science, and the psychology of science has illuminated many hidden characters and brought into view and brought to life some of the most remarkable discoveries that have transformed our lives over the past few centuries. I first met Dava when I had the unusual honor of conversing with her about my book, The Mapping of Heavens, and her wonderful book, The Glass Universe, that both came out roughly at the same time at the Philadelphia Museum of Art some 7-8 years ago. I have personally been a long-time fangirl and find her writing, thoroughly researched writing, rich in detail, simply transcendent. So Dava Sobel, a former New York Times science reporter, is the author of Longitude, Galileo's Daughter, The Planets, A More Perfect Heaven, and she has also co-authored 6 books, including Is Anyone Out There with astronomer Frank Drake. She's been a longtime science contributor to many, many magazines, Harvard Magazine, Audubon, Discover, Life, Omni, New Yorker, and she continues to write for several online and print publications. She has received numerous awards, so I will recount just a few to give you a sense of the kind of impact that her writing has had. She received the 2001 Individual Public Service Award from the National Science Board for fostering general awareness of science and technology amongst broad segments of the general public. In 2001, the Boston Museum of Science gave her its prestigious Bradford Washburn Award for her outstanding contribution towards the public understanding of science, appreciation of its fascination, and the vital role it plays in all our lives. In October 2004, in London, she accepted the Harrison Medal from the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in recognition for her contribution to increasing the awareness of the science of horology by the general public through her writing and lecturing. In 2008, the American Astronomical Society of the Pacific presented her with its Klumpke Roberts Award for increasing the public understanding and appreciation. Remember, we are just at 2014, and I've already given you just the highlights. So I will jump on. She has, of course, held many distinguished writers in residence. For example, the Robert Ware nonfiction writer at the University of Chicago, where she taught a seminar in science writing while pursuing research for her stage play about the 16th century astronomer Nicholas Copernicus and called And the Sun Stood Still. Her play was commissioned by Manhattan Theater Club through the Alfred T. Sloan Foundation Initiative and was also supported by a fellowship from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. And she, to just give you a sense of the number of printings, each one of her books, I'll just give you one example. Longitude went through 29 hardcover printings. Okay, so most of us, I've written one book. The first edition comes out in hardcover and then it's paperback, right? 29 hardcover printings before being reissued in October 2005 in a special 10th anniversary edition with a foreword now written by the astronaut Neil Armstrong. Soon after its original publication, 1995, the book was translated into 24 foreign languages and became a national and international bestseller, much to her surprise. And that's what's wonderful about her. So unassuming, humble, and remarkably down to earth. It has, of course, that book, Longitude, won many literary prizes, was the book of the year, and She also, as a sort of follow-up on the subject of longitude, she co-authored the illustrated Longitude. She then published one of my favorite books, Galileo's Daughter, based on the 124 surviving letters to Galileo from his eldest child. She translated the letters from the original Italian and used them to elucidate Galileo's life and work. And of course, this book won the 1999 Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Science and Technology, 2000 Christopher Award, and it was a finalist for the 2000 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. And the paperback edition enjoyed 5 consecutive weeks as the #1 New York Times nonfiction bestseller. Then she wrote a sequel, Letters to Father, containing the full text of Galileo's daughter's correspondence, both in English and Italian. And it was an English-only edition. It was became a Penguin Classic that followed later. So there was a PBS science program, NOVA, that produced a documentary called Lost at Sea, The Search for Longitude, which was based on her book. So as you can see, right, so her books spark plays, films, documentaries, and the list sort of goes on and on. So at the risk of not absorbing all her time and, getting off the stage very quickly myself, let me just quickly tell you, she's a 1964 graduate of the Bronx High School of Science. She attended Antioch College and the City College of New York, where she received a Bachelor of Arts degree from the State University of New York at Binghamton in 1969. She holds multiple honorary Doctor of Letters degrees, University of Bath in England, Middlebury College, and she also received an honorary Doctor of Science degree from the University of Bern in Switzerland. And she was the editor of this collection, this wonderful collection that's published every year, Best American Science Writing in 2004, and she, again, has served as a judge for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, the Penn E.O. Wilson Prize, and the Lewis Thomas Prize, awarded by the Rockefeller University to scientists who distinguish themselves as authors. Okay, today she will be talking to us about her new book, Madame Curie's Lab. And interestingly, Yale makes an appearance in this book, and I shall say no more and cede the floor to Dava. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to be here talking about Madame Curie. I am very late coming to the topic of women in science. Which only happened with the previous book, The Glass Universe. Because really, for the longest time, I didn't realize that it was an issue. Being female myself and not having anybody ever tell me girls aren't supposed to be interested in science or you're not smart enough to take physics, any of the things that routinely get said to young women. So having avoided all of that, I thought everybody else had avoided it too. But I was very wrong. And worse than that, just as a function of having grown up in the 1950s, I had absorbed a lot of negative attitudes about women that I wasn't aware I had. So when I started to write The Glass Universe, which was all about a group of women astronomers at Harvard. I know we're at Yale, but it was a Harvard story. I kept being surprised by what they had done. And after a while, I had to kind of smack myself and say, this is terrible. Why did I come to them with such low expectations? So that was a really transformative moment for me. And it was embarrassing, surprising, So I've got the religion now, and I'm atoning for my attitudes. And because of that, I really want to tell more stories about women in science. And my editor, hearing that, said, oh, well, how about a biography of Madame Curie? And I said, oh, no, I don't want to write about her. There are already a few biographies of her, and I don't have anything new to say. Well, that changed. Very shortly after that conversation, I was asked to review a book called Women in Their Element. And it was a collection of about 35 profiles of women chemists. And of course, Madame Curie was one of the profiles. Her daughter Irène was another. And I think I recognized maybe one other name. But the others, the profiles of the others, mentioned her. By the fifth or sixth time, somebody had come from a foreign country to work in her lab or taken her course or somehow been influenced by her. I thought, this is starting to sound like a network. And I got in touch with the Curie Museum in Paris to get a count. And there were 45 women who passed through her lab. So I called the editor right away and I said, I have something new to say about Madame Curie. And At Madame Curie's Lab was my working title for this book, and everyone at the publishing house hated it. And they made me change it to The Elements of Marie Curie. It's all right. you know. So I'm not the only person coming late to the issue. You may have seen this portrait. So this portrait was made public about the same time my book about the Harvard astronomers came out. And that very game-looking woman by the telescope is Margareta Palmer, and she does make an appearance in the glass universe. But Madame Curie, as I probably don't need to tell you, is the most famous woman in the history of science for many reasons. She discovered 2 elements, and she won 2 Nobel Prizes. She remains the only person ever to have won the Nobel Prize in both chemistry and physics. And that's not likely to happen again. But she was never the only one, and she certainly didn't want to be the only one. So this is an early family portrait. That's Marie standing behind her father. And her mother is not in the picture because she died when Marie was only 10. There's also another sister who died of typhus at age 14. And there's a brother, an older brother who is already off on his medical career, a path that was not open to the girls in Warsaw. So she had a lot of grief in her life, even from a very early age, and was always challenged to get over something difficult, to do what she wanted to do. So Warsaw at that time was under Russian control, and women were barred from university study. So even though her parents, who were both teachers, thought that she deserved a higher education, it was not available to her. So that's Marie standing, and her older sister, Bronya, who also wanted to become a doctor. So they made a pact. They would work and save. Marie would work as a governess, and Bronya would go first to Paris because at the Sorbonne, women were admitted. And then when she became a doctor, it would be Marie's turn to go to Paris and get her degree. And that's what they did. And Marie's original goal with her education was to go back to Warsaw and educate the Polish people and help them preserve their culture, of which she was very proud. But then she met Pierre and fell in love. And she said even though it was a great grief to her to remain forever in Paris, that's what she decided to do. So they met because she had a chance to do a project for the French steel industry, and it involved magnetism, and Pierre was a known expert on magnetism, so someone introduced them. And I kind of love the fact that the French word for magnet is the same as the word for lover. And against their expectations about what would happen at this meeting, they fell in love and got married. And they weren't really working on the same things. It wasn't till Marie's work got really interesting that Pierre dropped what he was doing and joined her. So X-rays had been discovered in 1895, and that was the huge big thing. Most physicists were really interested in that. There were, I think, 1,000 papers written about X-rays that within the first year. So some months later, when the uranic rays were discovered, it didn't really attract too much attention. So she decided she would do those rays for her PhD. And she did. So it was known at the beginning that anything containing uranium gave off these rays. So her first order of business was to test every other element to see if any of the others also gave off these rays. And she found that thorium also did. And then she started testing other compounds, and she found something that had so much activity that she concluded it had to be an unknown element that was also radioactive. That was her word, because uranic rays no longer applied once more than uranium was emitting them. She had tremendous family support. So that's Pierre, Marie, their daughter, Irène, and that is Pierre's father, who was widowed just around the time their daughter was born, and he volunteered to come and live with them and take care of the baby, whom he had delivered. He was a medical doctor, and let Marie go back to work in the lab, and that is how she was able to carry on her research. At the same time she was doing that, she was also teaching. Teaching was a constant throughout her life. It was very important to her. And she taught at a school for young women who wanted to become high school teachers. And she taught physics. And that gentleman is Paul Langevin, who taught mathematics at that school and had studied under Pierre and was a very close friend of both of theirs. So the work that Marie did that attracted Pierre's interest and that led to the discovery of two new elements, polonium, named for her homeland, and radium, named for its intense radioactivity, won them half of the 1903 Nobel Prize in physics. This made her instantly world famous. The Nobel Prizes were new, and the fact that a woman won one, so she was the first woman to win a prize in any of the categories. And then when people saw the shoddy laboratory conditions that this young couple had worked in, it was pretty unbelievable. They had what was an old anatomy theater. They called it the hangar or the shed. and the roof leaked. It actually had glass in the ceiling, an actual glass ceiling, and some scientist who came to see it said that he thought at first that it was a practical joke because it looked like a cross between a root cellar and a stable. But somehow this is where they had done their fabulous work. And they said they used to, I'm just looking at the lovely flowers and the blue glow. I'm wondering, was that intentional, Priya? Yes, okay. Because they used to sneak back to the shed at night because all the products would glow in the dark in this beautiful blue color. Thank you. I noticed. So, the Nobel Prize, which made them famous, completely ruined their lives. They couldn't get anything done. They complained about it bitterly, but they were managing. Unfortunately, 3 years later, Pierre was killed in an accident in the street, and she was left a widow at age 38 with these 2 young children. And remarkably, and against all tradition, she was invited to take over the laboratory where they had worked together and also to step into Pierre's teaching position. He was on the faculty at the Sorbonne. So she became the first woman ever to teach at that centuries-old institution. And in that position, now, she's world famous because she's won the Nobel Prize. Now she's the only woman in the world who's the head of a laboratory and teaching at a major university. So she is a magnet for other women who are interested in going into science. And that's how these 45 women started to come to her lab. So the first one was Harriet Brooks, who came from Canada. Within months of Pierre's death. So he died in April, and by autumn, she was there. And Harriet had unusual experience. She had worked with Ernest Rutherford and J.J. Thomson. After Madame Curie, she was the top woman in that field. But after just a few months, she got married and dropped out and managed to convince herself that really women were ill-suited to science. Ellen Gleditsch was the third one to come to the lab. She came from Norway, and she was fascinated by radioactivity, by Madame Curie. She had never encountered any radio element before arriving at the lab. She didn't really speak French, but she was highly motivated, and she learned very quickly and had a good background as a chemist, so she fit right in that way. And Madame Curie partnered with her on an important study, and they published together. So this is Bertram Boltwood, who was on the Yale faculty. And he also became very interested in radioactivity around 1904 when Ernest Rutherford visited Yale and gave a lecture. And the two of them became very friendly and corresponded for years. And there's a collection of their letters that I highly recommend, full of gossip, really. I mean, it always surprises me how much men enjoy gossip. But, I probably don't have to tell you that they do. So here's Boltwood again in the middle. That's Rutherford over here, and that is Otto Hahn. And this picture was taken at the University of Manchester when Boltwood spent a year there working with Rutherford. And later, Ellen Gleditsch came to Yale for a year and worked in Boltwood's lab. He happened to be in Europe when she let him know she was on her way. So the letter got forwarded a few times, and it was too late for him to tell her not to come. So he did host her, and she wound up really doing important work and settling the half-life of radium, which he and Rutherford disagreed on. At the same time that Madame Curie was teaching at the Sorbonne and running this laboratory, she could no longer teach her students at the Academy for Female Teachers, but she created a school for her daughter because she had very strong ideas about education and felt that most of the French schools gave too much homework and they didn't allow the children enough outdoor physical exercise, which she considered crucial for healthy development. So she created this school with some of her pals on the faculty. And you imagine these youngsters, 10 to 14, something like that, and they're coming to the Sorbonne for physics with Madame Curie, chemistry with Jean Perrin. They visited the Louvre with an artist. They had French and history with someone teaching at the Collège de France. And it was an extraordinary cooperative school. And one of the students kept her notes of Madame Curie's lectures. And this is published. You can actually buy this book with the students' handwritten notes and the little diagrams. She had them make a barometer. That was one of the experiments. She was very big on hands-on projects. But for all her fame, in 1910, when people who admired her nominated her to the French Academy of Sciences, she was not voted in on the grounds that she was a woman, and immutable tradition dictated that only men could be in the academy. This was such an embarrassment. Here she is one of the world's experts on this field, and she cannot present the findings of her colleagues at the weekly meetings of this organization. She has to ask one of her friends to do that for her. And when questions come up at the academy about the validity of someone else's work on radioactivity, she is not there to consult and offer an opinion. Nevertheless, she was not admitted. So the election had been held in January 1911. She wasn't admitted there. Nevertheless, she was considered one of the most important physicists in the world. So this is a very famous photograph. Maybe some of you have seen it before. It is the first Solvay Council. So Ernest Solvay, who had made a fortune from his chemical works, decided to gather the best physicists in the world and put them together in a room where he could listen to them talking about the new developments in physics, mainly the idea of the quantum, ideas about relativity. And you'll notice she's the only woman in the room. She is chatting with Henri Poincaré, that's Einstein, Paul Langevin, closest to me, Einstein, Rutherford, Max Planck. This was her milieu. As soon as the meeting ended, press reports came out about her affair with Paul Langevin. So Pierre had been dead for 5 years at this point, and Paul was very unhappily married and had been complaining to her about this. And I think she really believed that he was leaving the marriage and that she would have a second chance at a relationship that was not only a loving relationship, but a relationship about science, where they would work together. But that did not happen. He did not leave his wife. And this very ugly scandal erupted and really made her sick. At the same time, word came out that she was to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry by herself. So she asked the committee whether she should really show up because of all these terrible things being said about her in the press. She was a foreigner, a homewrecker. But they said, oh, nobody believes the lies in the French press. Just don't worry about it. But then, a few days later, they wrote to her again, and they strongly suggested that she stay home. And that made her angry. And she said, the prize has been awarded for my scientific work, and that has nothing to do with the scandalous accounts of my personal life. And she went to Stockholm with her sister Branja and her daughter Irène. And, and nothing terrible happened. So having met Einstein at the Solvay Council, they were very good friends. And he was one of the people who really stood up for her. When these reports came out, he wrote to her, I'm going to read you his letter. Highly esteemed Madame Curie, do not laugh at me for writing you without having anything sensible to say. But I am so enraged by the base manner in which the public is presently daring to concern itself with you that I absolutely must give vent to this feeling. However, I am convinced that you consistently despise this rabble, whether it obsequiously lavishes respect on you or whether it attempts to satiate its lust for sensationalism. I am impelled to tell you how much I have come to admire your intellect, your drive, and your honesty, and that I consider myself lucky to have made your personal acquaintance in Brussels. Anyone who does not number among these reptiles is certainly happy, now as before, that we have such personages among us as you and Langevin too, real people with whom one feels privileged to be in contact. So, of course, she came in for a lot of negativity. A lot of people believed that she didn't really think about things. She just had the patience to do a lot of boring work. This is a very common trope about women in science. You hear it all the time. The women do the scut work, and the men just have aha moments 24/7. That's really not the way it is, as anyone who actually does science can tell you. The other thing that's often said about her is that it was really Pierre who had all the good ideas, and she was just his assistant. No, that is not true either. She had a good friend in physicist Hertha Ayrton in England, and Hertha was also married to a physicist, and the way they got around having Hertha be pictured as just her husband's lackey was that they never worked together. So Hertha got admitted to all male scientific societies on her own merits, and she defended Madame whenever she saw anybody say that the work had really been done by Pierre, she would speak up, and her quote, "Errors are notoriously hard to kill. But an error that ascribes to a man what was actually the work of a woman has more lives than a cat." So the Solvay Council continued to meet approximately every 3 years. And just for a kind of Where's Waldo moment, can you find Marie? She's the one in the hat. She's still the only woman. Here we are in 1922. She has a fox stole that my grandmother also had. And here she is again in 1927. She's seated in the front row between Max Planck and Henrik Lorentz. So, again, these were her peers. This was her community. At the outbreak of the First World War, she considered it her duty to make use of X-rays. She concluded instantly that this would be the first time that wounded soldiers could be X-rayed, and that it would have a phenomenal effect. And so she got someone to give her a car. She didn't know how to drive, but she got a car, and she outfitted it with X-ray equipment and drove to the front. And she personally outfitted 19 of these vehicles. And then she had to convince the doctors that this was a good idea. That was not always easy. But as soon as she made an example, they were converted. And then she would offer to set up an X-ray unit in the field hospital, and she'd have to follow through on that. And she took along her daughter, who was only 17, but who trained as a nurse and learned how to do this same kind of work. Unfortunately, you notice how they're dressed. They're just wearing kind of lab coats. You know what happens when you go to the dentist for X-rays? The dosage here was a lot higher, and they were doing it all day long. And so the need was tremendous, and the two of them could spread themselves only so thin. So she set up a course for any French woman who was interested in learning how to do this work. 6 weeks. She taught them electricity, X-ray, theory and practice, and human anatomy. And then they were X-ray technicians. 150 women. But just before the war, so I showed you the picture of the shed, these ridiculous working conditions they had. Even when they moved to the Sorbonne, it was a very small lab, and the rooms weren't together. It was inconvenient. She worked her whole life to get a real laboratory that would do Pierre proud. And this is the Radium Institute in Paris. It was actually 2 institutes. She was in charge of the one that did the basic research in physics and chemistry, and the other one was completely medical, because radium very quickly proved to be the cure for cancer. So this also gave her further reputation as a great humanitarian. But it was just about to open when the war started, so nothing happened till after the war. But now she had this enlarged space. She had room for lots of people. She was still attracting. She never went out and tried to find women. She just didn't say no when they applied, not because they were women. They had to be qualified. And men came too, from all over the world, including as far away as India and Japan. And she was also involved after the war in a committee for the League of Nations to try to prevent another war. So she was on this International Committee for Intellectual Cooperation. And not the only woman this time. Christine Bonnevie of Norway was also on the committee. And what Marie wanted to do was get more scholarship money for people to study abroad. That would help improve international relations. And she also wanted to create a bibliography, a scientific bibliography, so that people could see what was being published everywhere about everything. Kind of an early Google. And she got remarkably little cooperation on that. It never happened. She was very frustrated. But because of her fame, her good work, she attracted the attention of the woman at the far end there, Marie Mattingly Maloney, who was a magazine writer and editor, and really thought it was terrible that the lab after the war didn't have a rich supply of radium. And so she raised money in the United States to buy Madame Curie a gram of radium. It was $100,000. And she was successful and brought Marie and her two daughters to this country and dragged them all around to get honorary degrees, meet people. It was exhausting for Marie, but she was very grateful and tried to be a good sport about all the fuss. And she accepted a symbol of the gift from President Warren Harding. Just another day in her very remarkable life. Irène, meanwhile, while she was being a nurse during the war, was all the time working, getting her undergraduate certificates, and she came to work at the Institute as a preparator and started working towards her doctoral degree, which she earned in 1925. This young man came to work at the lab recommended by Paul Langevin. So that was really Marie's chief criterion for admission to the lab, a recommendation from somebody she knew well and trusted, even if you had no experience in radioactivity, which was the case here, she would give you a chance. And so he was kind of assigned to Irène for his formation in radioactivity, and that was a very successful experiment, and they wound up getting married and becoming a great team, just like Marie and Pierre, and in fact shared the Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1935. So Irène was never admitted either to the French Academy of Sciences. She tried several times to kind of stick it to them because here she was, another Nobel Prize winner, and still couldn't gain admission. So the first woman admitted was Marguerite Perret, who had been hired as a lab technician by Marie toward the end of her life. And Margaret was working, trying to gather enough actinium to get its spectrum, to learn about it, and at the time of Madame Curie's death. So projects got disrupted, but she stayed at the lab and she continued working, and she actually discovered the element francium. So this made her quite famous, and she was encouraged. So she had training really only as a lab technician, but after that discovery, her friends at the lab encouraged her to get a doctoral degree, which she did, and went on to become a professor and head of a laboratory in Strasbourg, and become the first woman admitted to the French Academy of Sciences. But it was only a quasi membership. She couldn't really vote, and that the full membership granted to a woman didn't happen till 1979. Yeah. Yvonne Choquet-Bruhat, specialist in general relativity at what was then the Pierre and Marie Curie University, Paris. So you might ask, but she did all these great things. She's obviously a fantastic figure, but what is her relevance today? And I think she has a lot of relevance through this. There's so much in the news. We've been through this contentious election cycle. There are wars going on, violence in the streets. Why her? Why now? Partly as an escape. Partly I think it's good to be reminded of how good people can be. I spent the whole pandemic with her, and it was great. Just great to think about the things that she had gone through during that time. Her daughter, her younger daughter, Eve, who wrote the first biography of her, said that she was tempted to tell her mother's story as a legend because there were so many gigantic moments in her life. And it's just good to think about people like that. And the funny thing is, she still speaks to people. I meet people all the time who tell me, "Oh, she's my heroine," or I've always looked up to her as an inspirational figure. She still works for young women. I was recently in Madison, Wisconsin for their science festival, and a young woman came up to tell me that when she was 5 years old, she had learned about Madame Curie, and she decided then and there she was going to be a chemist. And she had just enrolled at the University of Wisconsin as a freshman chemistry major. So, the importance of role models and the things in her life. I mean, I showed you the picture of her father, the childcare situation she had. In this country today, 40% of women scientists drop out when they have a child because there isn't available childcare. So I think she still has a lot of things to say to us, and she, not just her, but the women who surrounded her. Together, they say, women have always been interested in science. It's not freakish. There are a lot of them. It just so happens that our names disappear. They fall off the papers sometimes, or the prize citations, but we were there. And so I'm very happy to have played some part in telling their stories along with her story. So thank you. And yeah, sure.
So we'll have a brief Q&A, so please feel free to ask questions. we have a roving mic?
I think there are two here.
Yeah, great.
There are two, actually.
You can hang on to one.
Thank you. That was really great. I'm a chemist, and she's my hero too. I'm curious if reading all this background material on her, what was her style as a scientist or interacting with people? Was she quiet or forceful? What was her way of motivating people? I think that's a great thing to learn about our heroes.
How did she motivate them? I think they came motivated. She selected for that. Her writing style is remarkably clear. I was very impressed by that. And she immediately collaborated with newcomers. So that was another way of engaging them and getting them involved in the work. And at the beginning, they had to help produce the radium. So this was a very hands-on problem. There was a separate little pavilion where they had an arrangement with a factory that would do the preliminary breakdown of the ore. But then there was a lot of work to wind up with radium chloride, which is what they worked with. So she would get people started doing that. Is that enough? And she had someone else in the lab who was the chief of operations, who did most of the talking to the students because she was too busy. Later, after the war, she did more of it. And I think she just got more used to talking. And sometimes it was a language barrier. So at the beginning, she really didn't speak English. So I think with Harriet Brooks, they didn't, maybe that was, I don't know. Harriet was in love. That was the main thing why she left. I think they got along fine because Madame Curie offered her a scholarship to stay on. So I was able to read a lot of, obviously I couldn't go to Paris because of the pandemic, but the amount of material that is available online really stunned me. Not just what you would expect, the papers, but the lab notebooks, but all the personal stuff. So she kept, for a year after Pierre's death, she kept a journal of her grief, handwritten. You can read the whole thing online. And another notebook where she talked about the developmental milestones of her children.
Hi, good evening. My name is Florian. I grew up in France, and Marie Curie was always a figure that came in. But I would like to really thank you for this talk because I never really knew, like when you grow up as a kid learning science in France, we always hear about Pierre and Marie Curie, and she's often the end of the relationship, and I truly didn't know, and it's a bit shameful. And I think it's a nice point to the fact that we all think that science is very different, and that like scientists will think that we have gender equality, but it's true that hearing about all of what she did was something that was never taught to me as a French child in science, because it was always like Pierre did something, and indeed Marie was there, and so thank you so much for that.
Thank you for saying that. I didn't know that. But again, it's not surprising. It happens here too, all the time. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the ripple effect that she had on her trainees. Like, do you happen to have any examples of, the legacy, like what are some of the most remarkable things that her trainees did, or what programs exist now that might not without, the folks that she trained?
Well, the thing that I found the most exciting in that vein was how many of these women went back to their own countries and became the first female professors there. So that was huge. Can I name the countries? The Netherlands for sure, Hungary. Ellen Gleditsch was the first person to teach radioactivity in Norway. So either they were the first woman or they were the first person expert in that field when they went home. Because a lot of them came from within France. But the number of things that are named after her, hospitals, schools, yeah. But even so, I think, how much does the average person here know about Yale as a person? Does that history always get communicated or learned? Or, just because the name is so big, we kind of accept it whether we know things about the person or not. But her story really is fantastic.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction to Marie Curie. You kind of hinted at this, the fact that she was exposed to X-rays and probably radioactivity without protection. And this is probably true of many of the pioneering scientists of that time. And I believe it did take a toll on her. Would you
yes.
to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So you would think, right away, they noticed that their hands got burned, the skin peeled, their fingers were numb. And then Becquerel, who was the one who discovered the uranic rays, he was carrying a sample of material in a pocket, and he got a burn on his torso in the shape of the tube. So they knew it destroyed tissue. And then Pierre intentionally gave himself a burn and published it, and how long it took for it to heal. So this is how the medical sphere latched on to radium as a treatment for cancer. And it worked. And in fact, the first cancer treatments were in the Curie lab. 2 women with breast cancer were brought into the lab and exposed to the material. But they didn't protect themselves. They didn't really understand. Forgive me for leaving out the important fact that radioactivity is one of the things that introduced the whole field of atomic physics, because radioactivity enabled the discovery of the nucleus. All of that happened because of these experiments. So they were not protecting themselves. They didn't know how dangerous it was, even though they had this clue. There's even an account of Rutherford's that he was on a train and lost a tube of radium salts. And he said, it'll probably be emitting radium emanation and alpha particles for thousands of years. And that's probably true. So there was a kind of cavalier attitude, but also ignorance. They started to really worry about 1920, and they introduced periodic blood tests, both in Paris and at the Cavendish. And then, but people would have a low blood count, they'd take a few days off, they'd feel better, they'd come back to work. It was all so interesting. Nobody wanted to stay away. And so her death the cause of death was given as aplastic anemia. And it's a combination of X-ray exposure and radioactivity, both. She didn't really know how dangerous it was until the story of the dial painters broke. So that was in the mid-1920s, these young women who were painting the numerals on watches and other instruments with paint that actually contained radium, which is something the Curies never advocated. And not only were they painting with radium, but they were told to bring the tip of the paintbrush to a point between their lips. So their jaws fell apart. And she heard about that and was horrified. But there she was. She'd been had more exposure than anybody, and she felt okay. So she didn't think she was endangering her daughter by letting her work there, or they just didn't know.
I may take the liberty of asking the question. So I was very curious about the contemporaries, her contemporaries, and how grudging they were in the acceptance of her intellectual contributions. Was it, before the Solvay Congress and before being part of that group, how was it, because it was experimental work, that it couldn't be questioned? I mean, I'm asking this from the point of view of a woman in science today, where even today, right, there's sort of grudging kind of acceptance sometimes.
I think her reception was less grudging than women today, actually. Even the first thing she did, where she did this industrial project for the steel industry. Some people felt she was an outsider. She shouldn't have been doing it.
But she was Polish and in France. I mean, there was
right, and metallurgy wasn't really her thing. Nevertheless, they really appreciated her work and used her recommendations. So it's almost as if she was so unusual they didn't know what to do with her.
Right.
Now I think it's easier. And there were fewer networks established. Now, I mean, if you read a book like The Exceptions by Kate Zernike, which is all about MIT and how women were just systematically given smaller spaces, everything, and lied to about it. That kind of thing wasn't going on yet. So in some ways, things got worse.
Thank you so much for this talk. I think in graduate school I learned, when I was learning painting restoration, that within a couple of years of its invention of X-radiography, paintings were X-rayed. And maybe a lot of that work took place at Harvard. But can you give us a picture of her involvement with the arts or any of the arts? Or
her involvement with the arts. Well, she certainly knew. She actually knew Rodin. And there was a dancer, Loie Fuller, who created dance programs with light and wanted to do something with radium. Of course, they couldn't let her do that, but the Curies entertained her and went to her show. They even went to seances. She was extremely well read. I don't know of any of her involvement with using X-rays to look at paintings. It wouldn't surprise me, I just don't know. She even wrote a couple of poems. Her family had a tradition of writing poems on special occasions, and she certainly read a lot of poetry in several languages.
You mentioned earlier that your interest in women in science. I was wondering what's next and why you're choosing what is next.
Well, I don't really have a good idea. I have a foggy sense. I just visited recently the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and it was their annual meeting, and the librarian had very kindly gone through their archives because Madame Curie was a member of the American Philosophical Society. So the question was, had she ever been in the building, and did they have any materials? And she produced 2 handwritten letters from her. And here I've spent my entire project just reading letters online, and here they were. It took me till the next day to suggest that somebody put a Geiger counter on them. And there were also minutes of a meeting that, yes, she had been there and been given the Benjamin Franklin Medal. So while there, looking at some other things, there's a marine biology station in Naples. It still exists. And they had a women's table. A table meaning a lab setup where people could come to do work. And that kind of intrigues me, but I don't know enough about it. I'm definitely looking for another subject. I'm 77. I don't know how much longer I can keep this going, but I'd like to try. I also, my current real job is I edit a poetry column in Scientific American, which I've been doing for 5 years now. And this is fascinating to me. So it's poems about science. And some of them are contributed by working scientists, some by high school teachers, even high school students, a couple of Pulitzer Prize winning poets, and I think I had 2 Nobel Prize winning scientists. So there's an anthology in the future there, if I can get the magazine to cooperate with me. That should probably be off the record, but it's too late. In fact, someone at Yale, I brought a couple of samples because people affiliated with this university have contributed to the column. It's called Meter.
Anyway, okay.
But the short answer is I'm open to suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, one final question before we wrap up.
You showed pictures of Marie Curie at the Salve conference, and it was during this time with a lot of debate about quantum theory. And I know she's coming from a more experimental side, but if there's any record of sort of her stance, during those debates, if she was more avant-garde or more of a more conservative with regard to the quantum debates.
In the Bohr-Einstein debates where she fell.
Yeah, she was definitely there when Einstein and Bohr were arguing, but I don't know that there's a record of what she said or if she took a strong stance. She was often asked to write about something in advance and read it at the meeting. I know she wrote about Compton, Arthur Holly Compton, and the Compton effect. And probably she contributed to the discussions. One of my best sources was her letters to her daughters, because they corresponded constantly. And she says things like, "I'm just so happy being here with all these lovers of physics. I've never set foot in the city because we just talk all day." And it's just all so interesting. And there's even a little film footage of her where everybody's just coming out of the building, and you see her for a few seconds, and she's all lit up, smiling. And usually there are no photographs of her smiling, so that really got my attention. She was really enjoying herself at those meetings.
Thank you.
Great. On that note, let's thank Dava for an excellent talk. Look forward to having you here for your next book, whatever it may be. So at this point, I just want to invite you all to the reception upstairs where we have some yummy food. And also just coming attractions, let me make a note of a talk on January 15th by Sebastian Sung, and it's going to be about mapping the brain. He's a neuroscientist who is at Princeton. And so I look forward to seeing you all next semester. Before I conclude, I'd like to thank Guy, Dr. Camp, and Ty for helping us with all the events this semester and keeping the Frankie program events sort of vibrant and really diverse. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming as well.